Hi there, welcome to class this week. We're going to look at conflict resolution, communication skills and time management. In regard to time management, we're going to look at how do we manage time. It's a big question, particularly in pastoral ministry at times when you're not as supervised that perhaps you are in other situations. Different perspectives of conflict, how do we handle conflict and different elements of conflict. We're going to look at different types of conflict management and challenges in addressing conflict. And then we're also going to look at appropriate communication skills and formats. And so these issues are very often interrelated. And so in regard to this week in class and the different videos, we're going to look at these things, and hopefully you'll learn along that journey as well as doing your readings to do with this subject. So let's have a look. So sometimes as a pastor, someone may come and here's a cartoon of someone that says you're fluent in 24 programming languages, but you can't even talk about the weather with me. You know, people sometimes are wanted just to talk small talk, and as a pastor, it's important to be a communicator at different levels with people where they're at as well. And so people are waiting and looking forward to you communicating the word of God to be applicable to their life. And so we're going to look at these things. Okay, time management will probably be the first one. And so let me ask you to reflect. What part of time management do you find most difficult in your own life? And so think about that for a moment. In your own personal life, what do you wrestle with in regard to time management? Is it getting to work on time? Is it finishing on time when you're running meetings? Is it getting the work done, feeling prepared, having some time for yourself and having some time for your family? So these are good questions for us to reflect on and ask ourselves. So time management is a huge issue, not just in the pastoral ministry, but in society alone. We live in a 24/7 society now where you can shop, you can pay your bills, etc., any time of the day or night. We have 24/7 shops where you can go and buy a coffee all through the night, 24-hour pancake parlors and restaurants and so on. And so it can be a challenge at times to manage our time. While technology has made life more simple in some ways, it's also led to increased expectations of what one can cram into a day. Also, in regard to things like Facebook and Instagram and so on, people can actually waste a lot of time on their various platforms. As a result of that, rather than them being a blessing, they can become a greater burden on the time management. In pastoral ministry, time management is essential because we do work to deadlines, and so with deadlines of having our sermons prepared, deadlines to running board meetings, deadlines to various appointments and so on, and so we need to manage time well. And so let's think about, firstly, when we're thinking about time management, in regard to our non-negotiable commitments, if we're going to manage our time. So time with our family, if we're going to maintain a long term in ministry, we need to have time for our family, which is non-negotiable. You can't put your family aside and just throw yourself into your ministry, otherwise your family will not last a distance, and therefore your ministry won't last a distance. So time with your spouse, time with your children, time with your parents and siblings, and so quality time, extra curricular activities that take place and events within the family and activities the children may have, evening events and so on. It's important that you manage those for the sake of your family. Time for your personal health, eating well, exercising adequately, appropriate time for rest and socializing. And so oftentimes an imbalanced spiritual focus of pastors can often result in the neglect of this, where I've got to pray more, I've got to read my Bible, I've got to do the work of the ministry, and they can neglect their own physical health as a result. And the non-9-to-5 nature of pastoring can lead to this, where oftentimes most people in the church are working between 9 to 5, and so when they want to see the pastor, when board meetings happen and various meetings take place, are outside of that 9 to 5 structure. And so you've got to make sure you manage your personal health around those things as well. Life maintenance, so cooking and cleaning and doctor's appointments, car servicing, again, executing these well will assist the other two priorities as well. So if you don't prioritise the above three issues, you will not last long as far as ministry is concerned. And time versus money, and so consider if it's worth outsourcing some elements that become elephants of life maintenance. So housework, maybe for female pastors, for example, paying someone to do some cleaning and washing and so on, and for male ministers as well that perhaps are single or perhaps do that. And so maybe it might be easier to pay someone so that you've got more time with the family, more time for your own health. Groceries delivered to your door rather than actually going out to do the shopping, ordering online and getting them come. Garden maintenance, building work, outsourcing these for both time saving and relieving the stress of doing those things. Taxes, having good accountants is worth the cost of the number of hours that can be saved doing your own taxes. And so thinking about these things, I want you to think about that as a pastor when you're in that role. If you're already in that role, how can you manage your time and create more spaces, more margins of your time to fulfill all that God has called you to do, both within your family, your personal life, and your ministry life. Let's take a break. Hi again, we're going to continue to discuss ministry practices, and particularly in the area of time management in this video, and time management at work. Most people will often work on a general weekly schedule. Others work on a fortnightly or even a monthly schedule. And so the best way to manage your time is to have a calendar with the essential commitments required per cycle. And so situations such as family commitments, making sure you're fitting in to your calendar or to your diary, time with the family, times with your parents, times with siblings and so on. So lock those in to make sure you're not neglecting your family. Also block out consistent times for personal rest and schedule in times for exercise, and sometimes these things can combine where you're relaxing by doing some exercise or relaxing by doing some sort of recreation as such. These things are important, but if you don't diarise them or block them out and schedule them, oftentimes they won't happen. In regard to life maintenance, oftentimes spacing this out makes it easier to deal with, and so do these things outside of peak hour times, such as if you need to go to the doctor, try and work out when it's least busy so you're not waiting for the doctor for hours on end, or the dentist and so on, and so put them in times. Also using some of those life maintenance issues that are part of your life cycle, and so while you drop your kids off at soccer training, maybe doing your shopping or making some calls and so on, or if you're at the soccer training, make some calls while you're waiting in the car watching your child going through their practice routines and so on. Putting on some washing when you're at the gym before you go to the gym, so when you come back you can take that out and dry it, or on a trip to the tip, make some phone calls, obviously with your hands-free apparatus in your car. And so when you're driving to appointments and so on, using those times, which often I would do using my hands-free when I was pastoring, and in between appointments when I'm driving there, make some calls and utilise that time rather than just sitting in the car and getting frustrated over the traffic. And so in regard to work as well, take a time log of your typical work cycle. Look at your diary over a period of time and look at those things that you're spending a lot of time on and particular activities, and ask the following questions. James Berkeley suggests this: what would happen if this wasn't done at all, this particular activity. Do I need to do it, for example? Which of these activities could be better done by someone else with better skills, or maybe someone that could do it well without me having to carry that and do that? So what can I delegate? In line with this, also learn to say no to others. Oftentimes people want to put their ideas onto you for you to do further things, and so manage your time by not saying yes to everything. No is a small word. Yes is a bit longer, and so realize, say no, that's okay. Am I wasting someone else's time involving someone in something but then taking the job back? And so am I releasing people to do the work that I've asked them to do rather than interfering? Do some of these activities come from a lack of system or foresight, and so I'm doing things and I'm repeating myself rather than thinking through the system processes of that? Am I attending too many meetings? Do I need to go to every meeting that's happening that I've been invited to go to or that's part of my schedule? And so ensure, even if you're running meetings, ensure they have a clear agenda and stay within time limits, such as board meetings, such as activities and so on. Set an agenda, work through that, and for the sake of not just yourself, but for the sake of respecting other people's time as well. In regarding efficiency, and so identify your concentration or when your concentration is best, and arrange to work on detailed projects at this time. For example, for myself, administration and those sorts of roles were best suited for me in the morning when my mind was fresh, I could think clearly. And so during this time, turn off your phone and email and put up the do not disturb sign and do those administrative roles if they're in the morning or afternoon or evening. Determine your attention span and organise activities. Just going back to the other one, also then, so what I do in the morning, do all the administrative activities, in the afternoon do my visitation, my appointments with people, where it was less concentrated in terms of ideas and allowing people and listening and helping people and fellowshipping with people. Determine your attention span and organise activities around blocks of time, such as 45, 60, 90-minute blocks. I tend to operate within about an hour and a half, 90 minutes, and then I need about a 10-minute break and then come back and be fresh to go again. So I break my morning up into 2 blocks, then have lunch, and then break into blocks in the afternoon. Sometimes 1 hour and I'm feeling tired, so I go for a walk and then come back. Ensure appropriate rest breaks throughout the day. Working through on one day completely often leads to decreased abilities the next day when you're feeling weary and tired and less creative. Unless it's an emergency, pre-arrange the length of appointments and visits with congregants. Otherwise, someone can come in with the idea, knock on your door, hey, Pastor, I just wanted to kill some time, thought I'd come and kill some of yours. And sometimes you need to say, all right, well, we need to make appointments. I need to be organised here. Otherwise, your whole day can be caught up with people just dropping in and killing your time. And so make sure, you know, obviously there's emergencies and things like that where people just need you there and then, but also manage your time as far as that's concerned. Otherwise, you end up going round and round in circles in the conversation and not accomplishing very much. Organising is half the battle, so ensure you have a clear and effective filing system for paper documents or soft copy documents, especially emails. Use the calendar feature to organise your meetings and deadlines and sync those with your phone so that reminds you of your appointments. Have a folder or corkboard or some organisation with key numbers that you need to get your hand on. I actually have a laminated sheet of paper which I update regularly. If I need to quickly get my hand on phone numbers, it's close on my desk so I can quickly look up a mobile number there. Use laptops and iPads to utilise dead time when you're on public transport, when you're commuting, even when you're flying and so on. Don't waste those hours or those moments, and utilise, make the most of your time when you're travelling. And so there's some tips, and we're going to take another break. Take a big breath, and we'll come back to the next video. Thank you. Hi again. We're continuing on the whole subject of ministry practices, and we're looking at time management. Now we're going to have a discussion regarding conflict management. And conflict is something that happens in everyone's life at some stage. And so conflict defined is a difference in opinion or purpose that can frustrate someone else's goals or desires. And so that's according to Ken Sand. And so there may be a sense that there's a conflicting opinion, there's a conflicting purpose. And so you need to be able to recognize that, and how do you manage that? Conflict results from perceived or real incompatibility of goals, values, and expectations. It may be real, it may be perceived, and it's not really there. You may think someone's saying something, but unless you manage that and deal with it, it can grow into something more dangerous. So conflict does not necessarily equate to sin. Just because there's a difference of opinion, it doesn't mean that you're in sin. I think about the situation of Saul and Barnabas. And so in that scripture, we find that Saul and Barnabas in the book of Acts have a deep conflict. Saul doesn't want to take John Mark onto the next journey with Barnabas. And so they have this conflict. And so Saul says, I'll take, who became Paul, I will take Silas because I can't take John Mark because he faltered last time. The pressure got to him. And Barnabas says, but, you know, he needs another opportunity. He needs another chance. And so Barnabas takes John Mark. In that situation, we find the next chapter, Saul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas are now in prison. They've been beaten. They're in stocks. They're worshipping God in the midst of that situation. The place shakes and their stocks are opened up and so on. And Barnabas takes John Mark. But later on, John Mark says, Paul says, I need John Mark. Send him to me. He can be good for my ministry. And so they disagreed. And if you look at the scriptures, both were right. And so it didn't mean that either of them were sinning, but they had a conflict of purpose and a conflict in a sense of their own way of personality, the way they dealt with things. Paul was very task-orientated. Barnabas was a son of consolation, very much pastoral. And so there was a conflict in the way they should go. The way people deal with conflict often depends on whether they see it as an opportunity or a destructive force. Conflict can be in the form of content or relational conflict, of personality conflict. And so oftentimes it happens. On this particular illustration there from Sand, Ken Sand, it's called the slippery slope. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, we find conflict can result in escape responses or peace faking, where the person says suicide, flight denial. We'll look at those things in a moment. It doesn't mean physical suicide, but actually just saying I don't deserve a result and so on. Then peacemaking responses, and then attack responses or peace-breaking responses. And so there's this sort of gauge of which way you deal with that, and we're going to have a look further at that. So the peace-breaking responses, the attack responses, which was, I go back to that screen on the right-hand side, and so assault, litigation, murder, and again, we're not talking physical, but we're talking about how people respond. A threat of physical, verbal, or financial force. Do what I want to do, or I will stop tithing. And I've experienced that throughout my pastoral, if you don't sing these hymns, we're going to stop tithing if you don't do this, and so on. Litigation of gossip and slander, where people take it to other people, appealing to others to turn against a person or cause, and so they try and bring other people into their conflict. And murder, as I said, not the physical murder, but underlying thoughts of anger or hatred aimed at the destruction of another person. I'm going to bring that person down. I'm going to break them. And examples of broken relationships and legal disputes and so on. And so that's not the way to deal with conflict. Then the other side of that is the escape responses or peace faking responses. And so there can be the denial. Well, I deny there's a problem. Or there can be flight, running away from conflict, leaving the church, quitting the ministry, avoiding particular people. This can be an appropriate response in some situations if there's abuse, but in most situations it's not the best way to handle conflict. And suicide, extreme response, removing yourself permanently to avoid dealing with the conflict. And unfortunately, as a pastor, I've seen people deal with conflict that way, where they just leave the church because they've had a disagreement with someone and they don't want to go back, they don't want to deal with it, they don't want someone to come and mediate. No, I'm just going to remove myself, I'm going to find somewhere else. Oftentimes they find conflict somewhere else and then move to the next place. So it's not the best way to deal with it. And then there's the conciliation responses, the peacemaking responses. And sometimes it's overlooking an offence, choosing to personally acknowledge an offence, but just to forgive and move on without pulling someone down. It's a little bit different from escaping, but it's acknowledging I have been offended, but I'm just going to deal with this and forgive this person. Or discussion for personal offences, so openly addressing an issue to seek confession, forgiveness, reconciliation, sometimes a misunderstanding. So there may be a situation that you've misunderstood. You thought somebody was offending you. That wasn't their intention. The initiating party then goes with the intent to listen, creating a dialogue rather than blunt accusation or confrontation. Negotiation for substantive offences where there's been a disagreement, but negotiating and finding concrete, measurable, objective issues. And so someone criticises your sermon topics, and so you go to them and say, well, let's talk about this. What do you think I've done wrong? How have I? With an open heart and a humble heart, listening so you can respond accordingly. Not defensively, but listening with grace and then working through and finding a solution. Assisted peacemaking is mediation. Sometimes you get to the point where you need a third unbiased person to provide an outside perspective that will assist. And as a pastor, many times I became a mediator between couples that were in marital crisis, between several people in church, to mediate and allow them to be able to speak, and at times say, hey, hang on, you've let the other person now speak, and so on, rather than just two people going at each other. Arbitration, sometimes outside decision making, sometimes where the Bible says now take it to the church or so on, to make some decisions in that regard. Accountability and church discipline, church assisted mediation or arbitration, where sometimes even denominational structures provide a process, or within the church dealing with those things. And so there's some of the ways that we manage conflict. And in our next video, we're going to have a look at some more ways of managing conflict. Thank you. Okay, continuing with ministry practices and conflict management. And so the start of the last video, we looked at the definition: a difference in opinion or purpose that frustrates someone's goals or desires. Conflict results from perceived or real incompatibility of goals, values, and expectations. And so we looked at conciliation responses, mediation, arbitration, accountability, and looking how do we manage these situations. And so when we look at that, and we look at this diagram right now, we say from the left to the right, so escape responses to attack responses. It goes from private, where you deal with it privately, or you deal with it publicly, and the further you go to the right, the more public it becomes. Also, the further you go to the right, the more cost is involved. So if you get to the point where you've got to have arbitration and accountability, there's a cost involved financially, cost involved with time and so on. And so the best thing to do is stay within the peacemaking responses, and so either overlook, if it's possible, reconcile, negotiate get to that point of mediation, if it doesn't get to that point, and so on. You never want to get to the point of assaulting or litigation or, so much hate towards somebody else that it seems like murder. And so also in regard to dealing with conflict, initially the escape responses deal with you. I'm going to just deal with this. I'm going to, pull myself away. I'm going to take off and or deny the situation. Or then it becomes about us. Okay, because I love you, I'm going to overlook the situation and move forward. Or I want to reconcile and begin a conversation and so on. And then the other end, it becomes, rather than about me, it becomes the accusation of you. This is your problem and you're the bad person, and, assault verbally, litigation, getting people involved, gossip and so on. And so the more you move from me to you, the more costs involved, but also the more pain that you can inflict if you don't deal with it in the middle, in the us way of the peacemaking responses. And so dealing with conflict, Ken Sand says a biblical response to conflict must not focus on either party, on me or you. It must involve us. The earlier conflicts are resolved, the less cost is involved. And so trying to deal with them quickly rather than let them build up and become this massive thing where one thing builds on another, and then it becomes very painful and sometimes hard to bring reconciliation. Biblical conflict resolution must focus on the outcome of restored relationships where possible. The goal is to restore relationships, not to say someone is right, someone is wrong, but to recognize and restore people back into relationship with one another. And so when we think of conflict, it's not always a bad thing. It can be an opportunity to grow. Sometimes in the conflicts that I've had with people throughout my ministry life and throughout my Christian life have developed into us becoming closer and having a deeper relationship, an honest relationship, and a love and respect for one another. So it's a chance to get to know someone better. It's a chance to bring issues into the open that you are trying to bury, but they need to be brought to the open. It's a chance to prevent larger conflicts that, I've known at times that people have not dealt with things, but they've let them build up and simmer underneath, almost like a volcano simmering, and then all of a sudden explodes and does a whole lot of damage. And so conflict is a natural part of relationship development. It shouldn't be avoided. It should be actually embraced in terms of when situations come. Let's embrace this. Let's acknowledge this. Let's discuss this, and let's use it as an opportunity to build a deeper relationship with one another. Conflict as a relationship destroyer disturbs peace in a relationship, even between friends, between relatives, even between married couples. It always leads to brokenness and should be avoided at all costs when it looks to destroy a relationship. And so you really need, at that time, a mediator to come in rather than just dealing with the conflict of your own when it gets to that point with the potential of breaking down a relationship. Elements of conflict. So usually relational conflict involves communication behaviours, perception of these behaviours. So the intention might be important to one person, but perception is equally important to the other. And so I've been in situations on both sides of the fence where I've perceived something that was very real to me, but the intention of the other person wasn't that. And so through conflict and through discussion, we've come back down, okay, you didn't intend that, and so I'm really sorry that I reacted to that. And vice versa, where my intention has been good, but it's been perceived as perhaps being negative or judgmental or something, even joking around where someone's being hurt. And so the intention and perception may be different, so we need to discuss these things. The dynamics of addressing intentions and perceptions vary depending on the conflicting parties involved, and so it's important to discuss that. And so thinking about intention, perception. So the best thing to do in conflict is ask the other person, how are you feeling at this point in time, to hear their intentions or perceptions, and then take it from there with a humble heart so that you can come to a point of reconciliation and deepening of your relationship. Thank you. Hi again, we're going to continue to discuss ministry practices and conflict management. And so there are different types of the way people manage their conflict. One is by dominating, insisting on your view, that resorts to forceful means. I'm the parent, you have to listen to me, dominating the situation, or insisting on your view. Well, I'm the boss, so you have to listen to me. Or maybe I'm right and you're wrong, I don't care what you've got to say. And so it's dominating the conflict, which doesn't actually help very much. The extreme of that is having an obliging approach, well, sacrificing your own agenda with the aim of satisfying other parties. And so you may feel wronged, you may feel abused, you may feel that you've been treated badly. And so rather than standing up and say, let's talk about this, you may say, well, I'm just going to sacrifice my own agenda and lay down to that and just keep taking a beating. Again, that's not the best way to handle it. Another way of handling it, many people avoid it, not engaging the conflict situation. And that can be linked to a belief that conflict is a relationship destroyer, which it not always is. And so rather than avoiding, there are times when you feel wronged. It's best to actually just speak and say, can you just say that again? Can you just discuss what you mean by that? And rather than avoiding the situation and avoiding conflict altogether. Some good ways can be compromising, where each party gives up a part of what they want. And so where there's a conflict of purpose, a conflict of direction, a conflict in a certain way of going, a solution, finding a solution that is halfway, where each party loses something but also gains something, so not everything is lost. The best way overall is integrating, where you exchange information to come up with a new mutually beneficial solution. It's not the same as compromising. It's more like, okay, let's find the best. Let's talk about this. This is what you're looking for in this discussion. This is what I'm looking for in this discussion. Let's find a really good solution where it's a win-win situation. It's not a lose-lose situation where sometimes compromising can be, or it can be lose-win on both parties. But integrating where it's a win-win situation, oftentimes when I would lead a board and sometimes there'd be conflict, I would say, well, guys, here's the skeleton, here's our agenda, but what I want you guys to do, this is what I feel the direction, here's the skeleton of what we're doing. We need to put the meat on the bones now, or here's the sketch, we need to colour in to make it look better. And so rather than having a lose-lose situation, no, we're not for that. No, guys, let's come up with a better picture of what this vision can look like. Conflict management strategies. And so, for example, when dealing with conflict, if you're an OH&S officer and something is dangerous, for example, a tile is sort of loose on the ceiling of the church, and one of those ceiling tiles, you need to deal with that straight away. You need to dominate, you need to get it happening straight away. Or if oil has been spilled at the entry of the church, rather than say, well, let's talk about this. Do we need to clean this up or not? No, you need to dominate. You need to say, this needs to be dealt with right now for the safety of everybody else. And so if someone is 10 minutes late, and they have a good explanation into your lecture or into your board meeting or staff meeting or whatever, avoidance sometimes is appropriate rather than demanding, well, you're 10 minutes late, you go home, you've got no reason to be late and so on, or dominating in that sense, but avoiding confronting and embarrassing that person, especially if they've had a flat tire on the way to work or something else and it's a genuine explanation. And so you you can avoid situations in that. Avoid bringing in irrelevant issues, and so isolate the specifics of the issue. Example is, for example, talking to someone about having better control over their youth in public, and then bringing up something different. Really, first you're late to planning meeting on Wednesdays, and now this is happening, and then building upon it, rather than just staying with that issue, perhaps with your youth pastor or something. Well, you know, the youth are going wild. When you take them to the beach or you take them on an outing, you just need to get more leaders around you to stop that happening, because it's creating danger to the public or danger to themselves. Not saying, well, you're also late, you're also this, you're also that. And so, do you have an example? Sometimes when conflict can become something other than the initial issue. And so we need to manage that better. Some additional suggestions in regard to conflict is, if we look at obvious reasons that may have caused the conflict. And so what happened? Jim is angry because you were moved to a bigger desk. So there's, you know, you're working in an office situation or whatever, all of a sudden you move to that, and so they're angry at you. And so at a youth planning meeting, you suggest a great low-cost idea that will get kids engaged. Other leaders agree, but the youth pastor doesn't. You think this is a great idea, and so look for what's causing that and discuss those situations. Another example is you're an elder of a church and you receive a letter from a long-standing member complaining about the new website layout. And so sometimes these things have a deeper reason. They may be a surface thing, but it's best to discuss that. What's the real issue under this? You seem to be angry at several issues. What's really happening in that situation? Sometimes you need a mediator if appropriate. And so someone that is not biased towards one party, someone that is mutual, so that they can hear both sides of the fence. Someone who is agreed upon by both parties. Well, let's talk to the pastor, or let's sort this thing out with this person that is not my best friend or your best friend. Someone who understands the area requiring mediation. If it's finance, get a financial advisor. If it's legal matters, if it's pastoral matters. If possible, meet on a neutral ground, not at one or the other's house or work, because then that's not mutual. And so you want to help people resolve their issues. You want to resolve your issues. Another way is to expand your repertoire on management strategies. And so can you design teams or management structures within your church to minimize harmful conflict? And so some churches have a group when people are going through difficulties where they can meet with that, or one or two counsellors to be able to discuss their conflict. Regular opportunities for feedback and dialogue, perhaps helping people around yourself where you can talk and say, how can I grow better? How can I do this? How can I handle this better? When you establish those teams, that can be very helpful. Consider the alternative of moving on. Sometimes people are not able or are unwilling to engage well in conflict. So the Bible says in Romans 12, in terms of conflict, and if it's possible, by you, be at peace with all men. And so as much as it depends on you. And so sometimes it doesn't depend on you. You try and resolve conflict. It doesn't. So sometimes you just got to move away, and you can't do anything about that conflict. Conflict challenges, as well as different strategies. There are other factors that can shape how a conflict plays out. And often how we overlook those, we can overlook those factors which can exasperate the situation. So, namely, communication can play a huge part in this. So we're going to look at communication in a moment, because sometimes how we communicate can exacerbate the situation or can resolve a situation. So after this video, let's have a look at communication. Thank you. We're going to continue this week in regard to ministry practices. So we've had a look at time management, and then we've looked at conflict management. And in order to avoid some conflict, it's good to look at communication skills, both in regard to dealing with conflict and also in regard to fulfilling the vision and purpose that God has for you as a pastor and a person that God has called for such a time as this. And so communication skills. Communication is primarily about how information is received rather than what is intended. And so as such, the message we send to someone is not always what is clearly received. Sometimes as a result of that, conflict can arise out of lack of communication or poor communication techniques. And so let's think about that. It's not just about what you've got to say, it's actually about how people receive that. And so we're going to cover some of those things in communication skills. So poor communication takes several forms. It doesn't use an appropriate platform at times to pass on the information. For example, telling somebody that their mother had just died via a text message is not the best way to communicate things. In fact, I was talking to someone recently that were speaking to their boss on the phone and during this COVID-19 situation, and so this person was concerned whether they still had a job or not. The boss didn't say anything, so they thought, oh, okay, everything seems all right. And then after putting the phone down and opening up their email, 5 minutes later an email comes to say you've got to stand down because of the COVID-19 situation. There's no work for you at the moment. And so receiving that by email would have been much better to receive that from their boss via the phone in conversation as such. And so this particular person then got back to their boss and said, you've just sent that, you need to contact all the other employees and give them a phone call to explain what's happening, because that was a rude awakening of receiving that. Good communication or bad communication sometimes uses inappropriate language and body language or concepts when passing on information. And so perhaps being passive aggressive or underestimating the level of knowledge of the person being communicated to. And so sometimes communicating in a very aggressive manner, or maybe communicating as if the person has no knowledge. And so you've got to understand who you're communicating to in order to have good communication and to communicate at their particular level. Questions to ask in shaping effective communication. Remember, it's not about you, it's about who you're communicating to. Is what is the appropriate platform to use in communicating this information? Is it best to meet the person face to face? Is it best to communicate via a text message or via a phone call or via a Zoom meeting, via an email and so on? In previous times before technology, a lot of people would communicate by writing letters. By writing a letter, they had to think through, especially if there was conflict, think through how they best write those words, how they best do it. Nowadays, you can send a text out of anger in a matter of seconds and communicate something without giving it time to filter your thoughts. And then all of a sudden, the person at the other end has been offended, has been hurt, and so on. And then later on you think, I wish I didn't respond so quickly. What language should I use to communicate the key concepts? So consider the level of knowledge of those receiving the information and tell them or to ask for clarification if needed. And so, do you understand what I'm saying? Does this make sense to you? Does it make, can you understand this? I remember situations where someone's communicating something and they think it's very clear, and they think that the way they're communicating it is very gracefully, and yet it was very domineering. Oftentimes my wife would speak to me at times with my children out of my enthusiasm. I'd be communicating, and at times my children would think I'm actually telling them off or something, and so my wife would say, hey, you need to be a bit more gentler in the way you communicate that, because the kids felt you were telling them rather than sharing information with them. And so it's important that we know and be aware of our own weaknesses in communication so that we can perhaps take a breath before we exuberate what we want to say and let it out. And so who should I involve in the communication? Often conflict arises when a person is accidentally left out of a key piece of information. And so I ask people to let you know if you've missed somebody, and there's somebody else I need to talk about in this situation that I need to tell in this. If you're resigning from your church, you need to obviously talk to those closest to you. You want to talk to your board, of course, and then you want to talk to other people within the church before it's announced publicly so that they're aware of what's happening and they're not disrespected in that. How should I time my communication of this information? And so asking a youth pastor to make a key decision affecting their role just before a youth meeting on a Friday night can be quite difficult. Sometimes as a pastor, someone would tell me just before I was going to preach, when we go around and shake hands, "Oh, pastor, just letting you know I'm leaving the church today, we're moving." And so I'm about to preach and feeling excited, and all of a sudden get this information and weighs heavily upon my heart while I'm trying to build the congregation up, where you're feeling disappointment and so on. And so choosing those moments so that it can be received in the best possible way. And so let's continue on communication in our next video and think about the other person we're communicating to. Thank you. Okay, continuing on with ministry practices and communication skills and challenges. And so when we're talking about communication, remember it's not about just your message, it's about the person you're communicating to. You want them to receive what you intend for them to receive, rather than them perceiving something totally different to what you're communicating with. And so there are other factors to consider in communicating effectively. Sometimes there's cultural differences that shape how people communicate, as you can see on the diagram here. And so it's not meeting, for example, someone's gaze out of respect. Some cultures don't look at you eye to eye because they feel that's being disrespectful. And in our Western society, we like to look me in the eye, talk to me. Other people look down because they feel it's being disrespectful. So understanding who we're communicating to, and so that affects how we communicate to them. Gender differences, the male, female, the battle in a sense of the sexes. And so how do we communicate to the opposite sex? And so oftentimes personally, when I want to go and buy something, a large item from a discount store or something, and always know that there's a certain margin that I can bring the price down a little bit because they allow for that, allow for bargaining. I don't like to do that with someone of the opposite sex. So I look for a guy, female might come up, "Can I help you?" I'm okay at the moment, just looking, and then see a male because I can go head to head better with a male as far as negotiating and so on, because I don't want to upset somebody, don't want to be too soft. So there's those gender differences. Men and women are often socialized into different types of communication, where men are perceived as being more direct and objective. Women can be perceived as being more relational and more sensitive, and that's a general thing. There are many people in the opposite sense where men can be more relational and often seen as being a bit wussy, a bit too sensitive, but that's their makeup. And so we've got to communicate in that way. And women can be more direct and often perceived as bossy. And so either if you're a male or a female, how you communicate, either as bossy or relational, but who you're communicating to, you've got to understand how can they best receive the message I'm wanting them to receive. Personality differences, and people think and function in different ways. And so the Myers-Briggs dichotomies, where there can be the introvert, extrovert person, or the person that's intuitive or a sensing type person, or a thinking compared to a feeling person, a judging compared to a perceiving type person, and knowing yourself, how you communicate, but also trying to understand how people best receive what you want to communicate is very important. Power differences, and so open door policies where your boss may say to you, well, come and talk to me if you see anything wrong with the organisation, whether it be your senior pastor or whatever, just come, the door's open, come and tell me. At the same time, you want to give them that honest opinion, but sometimes you also want to know when's the right timing to give them that opinion. What's the best way to talk about those things, and vice versa. As a pastor, many people have said to me, Pastor, you're like a father of the faith. Just feel free to speak into my life wherever you feel I need to change, or things that you see I could do better, whatever. And so oftentimes that's an open heart, open door policy. But I also have to, as a pastor, realize that sometimes when you act upon that, some people say that, but it's not actually what they want to hear. So you need to be aware of when is the best time to talk to them. And in a sense, what they talk about, the sandwich approach, start off with, hey, really love you, really appreciate what you're doing, what God is doing. However, we just need to adjust this. I've just noticed sometimes this needs to change a bit. And then, but overall, I want to tell you how much I love you, how much I appreciate you, and so on, rather than just going hard at, you need to change. This is what you're doing wrong. And immediately they're not ready to receive that. But also sometimes you just got to be sensitive to the person. Are they ready? Is it best to talk to them at this particular time? Sometimes it's political differences, not necessarily Liberal versus Labor or Democrats and Republicans or whatever political situation you're from, but in the sense the impact of a person or organisation's history on a particular situation. So choosing leaders and a family member has always led this organisation, and so sometimes pastors' children can be chosen because they're the pastor's child, but they may not necessarily be ready for a responsibility. Or the other extreme as well, I'm interviewing pastors' children at the moment for my next book on the voice of pastors' children, and had pastors' children say, I really felt God had called me to do this, but because I was a pastor's child, the youth pastor or the youth leader or person basically overlooked me because they didn't want it just to be jobs for the pastor's family, and yet they were crying out for that opportunity, felt called to that. And so there's that political differences that can even happen in the church or amongst board members and so on, where favour can be given or favour can be held back because of where people stand in the political hierarchy of situations. So differences also in perception or a definition of conflict. And so person A, we have to talk about this issue. Person B, what issue? There is no issue. And so that can be a challenge when one person says there's no issue, but you feel there is an issue. And so the best thing to do is to say, no, well, I'd just like to share what I'm feeling. And it may not be an issue to you, but I just need to resolve this in my own heart. Or it may be someone comes to you with an issue and you feel that there is no issue. The best thing to do is stop and allow them to share their heart and be a good listener and help them through that, because you want to resolve your conflict and hear what they have to say rather than treat it as if it's not important. Keys to effective communication is provide as much time and space as possible when you're communicating. If you're communicating to your church about a new vision, lead up to it, let them hear over a period of time. Don't just get up and say, well, next week we're no longer doing this in church. We're shutting down every service except Sunday morning, or we're taking on this new role, or whatever. Lead people, give them more time to begin to process what's taking place and prepare people in that sense. Communication platforms that allow for minimized misinterpretation are best. So think about what's the best platform. Texting allows for time to respond, but no body language or voice intonation, and so sometimes a text can come across as harsh. Emails allows for time, and you can put a lot more information there. Again, it doesn't actually allow for the voice intonation or for the body language. Phone calls allow for the tone of voice, but no body language. And face-to-face allows for the whole person communication. So think about the importance of what you're communicating and how best to do that. And oftentimes with a face-to-face communication, people can read your body language, they can see the tone, they can see your face, they can see what's happening, they can hear your tone of voice. And so I'm not saying that's always good for every situation. Sometimes texting is a great communication. Hey, don't forget the meeting's on tonight at 7:30. Looking forward to you coming, particularly with boards and so on, to remind them a few days before, don't forget our board meeting, and then on the day, dinner at 6:30, then we're going into our board meeting. Keys to effective communication: avoid passing on information via other parties. Sometimes it shows a lack of care or seriousness and can result in the old Chinese whispers, where somebody says something and it just gets a bit changed as it goes down the line until it means something totally different at the other end. And so when you want to get information, let it come directly from you as much as possible. Ensure that effective communication processes are in place. So in group emails and text messages, keep groups up to date when you wanting to share things with the life group or the youth group or the whole church. Keep them up to date in things that are taking place along the way. Meetings, provide enough warning, appropriate lead-up reminders to allow people time to add these to their agenda if appropriate, rather than 10 minutes before a meeting. Don't forget the board meeting's on, and so on. So take minutes of key meetings and send them out afterwards so people have time to think through and understand what's taking place. Keep communicating as a pastor to your church. Conclusion in this whole subject of ministry practices, we've looked at managing time. And so managing time well means that one can be more considered with their everyday activities. And so when you manage your time well, it's not last minute all the time, rush, but you can enter into meetings, you can enter into places well prepared, well settled, at peace within yourself, rather than rushing things through. Having good managed time then combined with clear communication skills can lead to minimized conflict. And so think about how you're communicating. Again, don't think about just what you want to communicate, but who you're communicating to so they can receive the message as clear as possible. Conflict is a normal part of life, and so you can't avoid conflict. From time to time, there will be conflict where people see things differently. As I said, with Paul and Barnabas sort of ministering together, they had a severe conflict because of their different personalities. Ultimately, through that, the best result came. Silas was with Paul. John Mark went off with Barnabas, and they came back eventually in unity. And so as they discussed that, you don't want severe conflict, but you want to discuss things and look at differences and come about the best possible way. Conflict can lead to uncomfortable changes, but oftentimes, and most times if handled well, can lead to growth both in relationships, in the purposes of God, in the purposes of the church. And so if there is conflict, just discuss it. And my attitude as a pastor was I used 3 L's when it came to conflict: listen, to people, love people, and then lead people. So people know they've been listened to and they know that you love them. Even if you have differing opinions, and discuss those, but keep leading as God has called you to lead. And oftentimes their conflicts, sometimes their differences can help shape the picture and shape the vision to be more fuller in its purpose. And so listen, love, and lead as far as leading God's people. And so I just pray God will cause you to be a great pastor, a great leader, and that the days ahead of you will be so fruitful, so fulfilled, and ultimately in the purposes of the kingdom of God, that you'll see many people in the kingdom because you've pastored people well and dealt with your management of time, dealt with conflict, and communicated well to your people. So God bless you and have a great ministry ahead. Thank you.